Hi, today I'm going to be talking about a kind of basic approach to algorithmically solving tactics problems. And kind of, oftentimes you're going to immediately see a solution to a tactic, but if you don't, what are the kind of steps you might want to go through? Or in a game of yours, if you're sure there's a tactic there, but you're not finding it, a kind of priority list of what moves to look at. So, first thing to do is just, what can I take, right? We can play queen takes bishop, and we can play knight takes bishop. We could also play queen takes knight, though the pawn defends it. And we're not immediately threatening to take anything else besides this pawn, which is clearly well defended, and also just a pawn, and this pawn, which is also defended. If we want to go a little further here, we might see that black is attacking something, their queen is attacking our pawn, and if our queen moves away, we're going to get checkmated, so we can immediately rule out queen takes bishop, but knight takes bishop looks good. The second thing we want to look at is checks. So many of tactics are determined by doing something with check. We have two checks. Knight e7 check, which is defended, and knight f6 check, which is not, and we already see we hit the king, rook, and queen. That is clearly better than taking the bishop. That is going to be our move. We can stop here. We found a good enough move. Sometimes tactics puzzles will tell you, aha, there's mate in 2. You don't actually want to win the queen. But hopefully, if we win their queen, we're confident we can win the game. We could look further and find mate, but if you're trying to solve problems quickly, if there's any time component involved, there's the famous line, if you see how to win a queen and how to checkmate, win the queen. And the idea is if you miscalculate the checkmate, things have probably gone, things can go wrong, but if you take the queen, you're going to win the game. The next steps, so the first is look at what can be captured for both players, but primarily what we can capture. The second is checks. The third would be captures. We already considered that first, but it is worth looking at captures in this stage a little beyond, like looking an extra half move. For instance, queen takes knight, pawn takes queen. Do we have a follow-up? No, certainly not. But it's worth here looking at that extra half move on the obvious captures, see if there's anything further there. If checks and captures haven't brought us to something, I think the next best thing to do, that you can switch the order of my last two, is forks. Do we have a knight? Can the knight go somewhere that forks stuff? And specifically knight forks, I mean. Here, we look in on our knight, we see knight b6, okay, we hit the rook, but that's covered by their bishop. Knight c7 hits the rook, but covered. Knight e7. Ooh, knight f6, we fork king, rook, and queen. So if we had not already seen that in the check section, if for instance their king was somewhere else, we still might find knight f6 because it hits their rook and queen in the fork step. And the final step, I have taken Dan Heisman's name for this because I think it's a nice one, AWL, attack with less. Can you attack a more valuable piece with a less valuable piece? The idea here is that you make a threat that they have to respond to. Pawns can often do so, though here we only have 3 pawn moves and none of them achieve it. This also might bring our attention to knight f6. We attack king, rook, and queen, 3 things with more value than the knight. So those are kind of going to be our priority list, and each position I see, I'm going to kind of just go through it. I'm not going to try to rush or anything, but just solve each problem from this priority list, and we're going to start with knight f6, a fork, and a check, and then take the queen. Now here, I want to see what can I take. Well, my queen can take the pawn, though it is defended 2 ways. My queen can take this pawn. It's defended only 1 way, but it is defended. And my rook can take this pawn, though it is defended 1 way. Checks. Queen takes pawn. That seems very well defended. Rook takes pawn. Seems fairly well defended. And rook h8, which sometimes is a tactic if I can bring the queen over to the h-file with check after to get quick access with the queen, but that is not the case here. Now, I could stop here, but we really want to look that kind of half move further than the directly obvious. Here, they can take 2 ways. It seems pretty hopeless. Here, they can only take 1 way, and if we looked at this queen and taking the pawn, which was worth considering, because one thing we might notice when we're considering it is that our queen pins the pawn to the king. So in fact, this pawn is not defended, and we can take it with checkmate, and we could find this move either in our checks or our captures phase. Here, what are we threatening? We're threatening this pawn, and this knight. All seem well defended and much lower value than our queen. What are they threatening? Checkmate on g2. So we're going to have to do something forceful. Okay, checks. What are our checks? Well, we have queen f4 and queen e5, and we have rook e8. And if we look at really any amount of time, oh, we also have queen c8, which looks not good. If we look any amount of time at these checks, we can see queen e5 not only hits the king, but attacks something else. And if we wanted to keep calculating further, we'd notice when we queen check, either they have to block with their queen, which means they will no longer threaten g2, or they have to move their king, and they cannot move it off the 8th rank, such that when we take the rook, it will be with check. So again, checks came through. Now here, we can look at potential captures. Our queen can take the pawn, the bishop, or the knight. Our knight can take the pawn. That looks very well defended. Our rook can take the knight. What can they take? Well, they can take our queen. So we should be thinking, what can we do with our queen? And this knight's undefended, so we're just going to take it. We don't have to go any further. Here, they attacked our queen again. Again, we're just going to look at captures first. We can take the bishop, but it's defended. We can take this bishop. It is defended, but our rook supports us. So we're going to take it and win a second piece. All right. Here, we can take their bishop, and we can't take anything else. Their bishop seems well enough defended for now. Step number 2. Do we have any checks? Their king's tucked away in the corner. We have no checks. Looking at captures again. Again, bishop takes, pawn takes. Maybe we could play knight g3 after, and then they'd defend their bishop, or their pawn now on f5. Not seeing much there. Okay, third step, knight forks. All right, we do have a knight. This hits a knight and it's defended. This hits a bishop and it's defended and can move. Here it doesn't hit anything. We don't have any knight forks. So the fourth and final one, we've run out of time, but we will get to the move, is attack with less. Can we attack something more valuable with something less valuable? There are only 2 pieces out on the board, are the knight on d5 and the bishop on f5. I can still pick up pieces. Oh, only the bishop and the knight for some reason. Maybe because I touched them and I can pick up pieces I touched. No, I can pick up the queen too, but I can't pick up pawns. Curious. Attack with less. The knight and the bishop. What's less valuable than a knight and a bishop? A pawn. So we should be looking at ways to attack their knight and bishop with pawns. Our g-pawn, the pawn in front of our king, going to g4, they could just take. That's not defended. But e4, aha, we attack the bishop and the knight. We get a fork, we're going to win one of them, and it is defended by our bishop. e4 was the move. So that we saw us go through the whole priority list. We looked at captures, we looked at checks, didn't really have them. And we could have dismissed them much quicker. You could see instantly, the king's on h8, I have no pieces close to it, there's not going to be a check. So then you'd go captures, then you'd go knight forks. Here, our knight's not advanced. Generally, knight forks are only going to be available if they have lots of pieces vaguely near our knight. Knights are slow-moving pieces. They have trouble forking things, particularly far away. And our knight here is fairly passively placed. So we could jump quite quickly to attack with less, and attack with less we will indeed spot e4. So let's do another one. Blitz Tactics, by the way, wonderful site, good for tactics testing. So let's be a bit faster this time, though the timer only starts after our first move. Captures and checks, you can switch up the order to them. I don't think the order matters. Similar to knight forks and attack with less. Whichever way you want to order it that works for you is fine. Here, we could do captures or checks first, but it's very easy to see. We don't actually have any checks in this position, so let's get to captures. We have bishop takes pawn and queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, hits the rook. That seems good. Queen takes pawn, hits the rook and the undefended bishop. That is our move. And they defended the bishop, so we'll take the rook. Now here, we have one check. Not good. Captures. We have no captures. None at all. Knight forks. Don't have any knight forks. The pawn defends our squares. The other squares here. Attack with less. We actually don't really have that either. We can't hit their knight. We can't hit their bishop. We can't hit their queen. So what to do if all of that has failed? At that point, you really want to hone in on undefended pieces. And the idea of the previous things is that they're going to be influenced by undefended pieces. Attack with less will often be hitting an under or undefended piece. But here, if we look at undefended pieces, we see their queen's defended, their bishop's defended. This rook isn't, this bishop is, this rook isn't, this knight isn't. Specifically, this knight is pretty far out. Can we attack it and one of the other undefended pieces at the same time? Loose pieces drop off is the useful phrase here. I didn't include it in the algorithm, but I probably should have. And our move is queen a5, hitting the knight and hitting the rook. Both are undefended. They can't save both. Here, they blocked our path to the rook, and we could probably take the knight or the bishop, but the knight's a little more threatening. It might come into b6. I didn't mean to actually take there, but... And now we just have to get our queen out of danger. It only has one safe square. All right. Actually, this is going to be very similar to the last one. But we get there a little more easily because if we start with captures, our only captures, queen takes d4, no good. Checks. We only have one check, queen a5. And if we look at this for a second, we'll see it hits the king. Does it hit anything else? Yes, it hits the bishop. And whenever we look at checks, a really important thing to do is, does it attack a second thing at the same time? Or can it be followed up with further checks? And here it attacks the second thing at the same time. So we're going to play queen a5 and queen takes g5. Okay, checks. I don't see any checks. Can we capture things? I can capture the bishop. That seems pretty good. I can capture the pawn. That might open up their king. I can capture this pawn. Also, they are threatening to take my knight. And they could be threatening to take this pawn, though right now it is well defended. At this point, I think just queen takes bishop. We can take it. It is not defended. Let's take it. They took our knight. We knew our knight was defended. And we can take back. Alright, let's start again with checks. Though, if we started with captures, we could see they're threatening check, and they might have a huge attack on us. They're also threatening our knight. Now, checks. We have knight e2 check, and knight e2 opens up our queen on their bishop. So we're going to play that, and our queen will still be able to come back and defend. We can run, and the queen defends. Alright, checks. Don't have any checks with the queen. We do with the knight. Check and check. This one's defended, this one isn't, and forks king, rook, and queen. So this would be our finish. Alright, gonna do one more, try to go a little faster, but we have our algorithm. It's, let's say checks first. Checks, captures, attack with less or knight forks, and do they have loose pieces? And if none of those solve the problem, it's probably a pretty tough problem. But I think we can get a good start by just having a really good sense of these 5 things. Alright. Checks. Rook takes g6. It's defended by the queen and the king. That seems very unlikely. Queen e3 or queen f4. Generally speaking, it does look like their king's pretty vulnerable. Their rook and queen could be vulnerable here, but if we look at captures, our only capture is queen takes b7, and that doesn't seem to be huge value, though it does hit the rook after. So I would want to start here with a check, and I generally want to move my queen closer to their king, because it's just more likely to have further powerful checks. So we force them out of here. We force them back a row. Now we can force them back another row, another check. Again, there's no real captures. Queen here would be okay, maybe, but their king could come back to h6, and we wouldn't be able to take on g6 because their queen defends. So I would like to push them back again, and here another check leads to checkmate. Now here we might think our knight's attacked, but if we look at checks first, we see queen h5. Okay, maybe their king runs out of the way. That's one possibility. That looks pretty good. Knight c7, their queen takes, and knight f6, and where does their king go? Oh, that's checkmate. The knight covers d7, the other knight covers f7. Alright, checks. Our knight has 2 checks, knight h4, which just gets taken, and knight d4, and aha, that forks king and rook. So we're going to play that and take the rook. Checks. Now we have 2 checks, f6 and e7. f6 looks pretty sweet. Their king has to go to g7 or h8, and then if we move it, our queen will have a discovered check, and we can grab their queen. That's a nice tactic. And if you played that in a game, that would be, I think, a wholly acceptable thing to do. But if we look for a second at knight e7, we'll notice this is just checkmate on the spot. Our queen controls all the squares the king could go to. Okay. Checks. We have 1 check, f7. It is defended. Maybe we'll come back to it. Captures. We have no captures. So now we move on to knight forks. We don't have a knight. And attack with less. Our queen's our most valuable piece. It's unlikely to, it's not going to attack something more valuable unless it's a king, and we already looked at checks. So what about our rook? Well, it could attack the queen. And if we look for a second, aha, their queen and king are on a line. We're going to win their queen because their queen is pinned to their king. And we can take their queen. Alright. Checks. No checks with the knight, despite being close to their king. I only see 1 check, queen h5 check. And this looks pretty good. If their king moves, we can infiltrate on f7 because our knight supports. And if they block with the pawn, we have a capture to take the pawn. This is very standard tactical motif. Take the pawn. When they take back, we take the rook. And if they don't take back, we can take the rook with the discovered check. Alright, checks. We have queen g8 and queen h8. Those are undefended, and we just lose the queen. We have knight f6. They have that defended with the pawn, the rook, and the queen, 3 different ways. And bishop f5, which is defended 2 ways. But if we look for an extra second, we'll notice, aha, our rook's lined up with our queen. We can follow up the check with a capture. Okay, checks. I see 2 checks. Check here, where they probably don't want to block with the rook, because I might be able to take with the pawn. They could block with this rook, because the other rook pins my pawn. And they could move their king. Or I could play check. Oh, their king doesn't have squares it can go to, so they'll have to block with the rook. I can take, and that's checkmate. Alright, checks. We have this one defended, but it would hit the rook, and this one defended with our queen. We also have rook down to the final rank. I can't move it, it won't let me move it. But that seems like they have it covered. But we do have a check here. That would force their king to c1. It has no other squares. And if we looked at further checks thereafter, we might notice, we have queen here, forking king and rook. So again, checks, captures, very useful. Most tactics problems will start with a check or a capture. And if you're in your own games and you're thinking, this position, it feels like something's shaky, I think there's something here. First, looking at checks and captures, even if the capture or check looks a little ridiculous, is a good thing to spend a little amount of time on. If that doesn't get you anywhere, well, where's a knight? Sometimes knights have forks. Those aren't going to come up as checks or captures, but they do solve tactical problems all the time. Sometimes they will be a check. We've seen some knight checks. Then attack with less. Can we attack some more valuable pieces with a less valuable piece? We saw that pawn fork of a knight and bishop earlier. This one's going to come up less in tactics, but very often in games. And then we have loose pieces drop off. If at this point you still haven't found it, look for what are the undefended pieces, and do I have any ways to attack a lot of them at once. Let's do one more. I'm going to go a little faster and just kind of go, is it a check? Is it a capture? Is it a knight fork? Is it an attack with less? Is it a loose pieces drop off? This one. Their back rank is very weak, and we can see this is the check that exploits it best. They don't have a good way to block, and they will give up all their pieces to do so. This one, we have a check. This pushes their king to the back, and we have another back rank. So far we've had 2 checks. We've already seen this problem. It is a check and a checkmate. This problem is the same motif we've already seen. Starts with a check, infiltrating, and if they block with the pawn, we can take with the knight, and then take the rook. Here, we don't have any checks. Do we have any captures? Bishop takes pawn. Nope, we don't have any captures. Do we have any knight forks? No, our knight doesn't seem to have much possibility. Do we have any attack with less? Could play e5, hit the knight, their pawn defends it. Do we have anything else? We could play b4, pushes their bishop back, isn't clear what it accomplishes. And we could play bishop b5. Oh hey, their queen and rook are on the same diagonal. We get the rook. Alright. Maybe I didn't cover promotion tactics with my themes, but this is still covered by checks and captures. We'd really like to get a queen, but their rook's stopping us. Can we move their rook away? Well, we have both a check and a capture, forking king and rook, and when they take, they are no longer stopping us getting a queen. I don't think my strategies did a good job of explaining this position. I think pawn motif strategies are a separate section of tactic, and I should probably have included that separately. Alright, checks. We have a check here. That seems not a good move. And we have a check here, which hits the king, the rook, and the bishop. Very unlikely they can save them all. They save the king and the rook, we take the bishop. Here, we don't have any checks. Captures, we have bishop takes knight, but it is defended. Queen takes knight, that's very well defended. Queen takes bishop, that's only defended once. Now, you might say this doesn't really count in my framework, but I would say once we've looked at captures and realized, aha, can't do this because of the knight, and this doesn't seem to help because they just recapture. But if I order it correctly and play bishop takes knight, I've removed the defender and now can take the bishop. Here, checks, I have knight f3. That might open up their king, but doesn't seem to do much. And queen h2, which also doesn't seem to do much. Now, captures. Can I just take on f1? I don't see why not. That's a more valuable piece. I'll take it. And now maybe I'll take on h2, which we already noticed I could take earlier. Checks. Queen takes f2. That seems defended. Captures. Queen takes f2 and queen takes h3. Knight takes f2. Those seem defended. Knight forks. Hey, knight c3 hits the rook and queen. It does open up their queen on our rook, but it is defended. So the move's knight c3. Checks. Don't have any checks. Captures. Can take on a4, but their bishop defends. Can take on a4 this way or this way. Maybe we should take on a4, but it's not too convincing. Let's move on. Knight forks. Nope. Nope. Yes, hits queen and rook. Knight fork it is. Checks. We can start invading on their king. We have another check, the knight defends, and a third check gets us to checkmate. Checks. This is just checkmate. There were other checks, but I wanted to get a few more points on the board before running out of time. And this one we'll pause and look at. Checks. There's knight takes h4. That's defended twice, though the g3 pawn is pinned. There is queen takes g3, and queen h3, and queen takes f3. That all seems well defended. There's also knight f4 check, and again the g3 pawn's pinned, so that's going to force king and queen. We could find this under the checks category, or looking at knight forks. So I hope that's useful for thinking about how to solve tactics. You can go much faster than this once you get a hang of it. There are lots of positions where you instantly, of course it's not a check, there's nothing near their king, and you can very quickly move on to what the actual thing is. Usually the following moves will also fit the same things. Not all of these were one movers, and you want to continue looking at checks and captures and the variations you look at, and attacks with less and knight forks too, as well as loose pieces. And I think with those tools you are fully capable of solving pretty much any problem that a site like Blitz Tactics throws at you. Besides, I suppose, promotion tactics, which I admit this doesn't cover very well. Hope that was useful to someone. Cheers.